Prime Minister preach austerity and restraint to Canadians and to his G20 colleagues when he's lost control of the costs of his own summit?
Exactly.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Order.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, as has been observed by many people, the cost of these summits in this age is very expensive because of the security demands that are placed on the summits.
They seem to enjoy that, don't they? So how much is security supposed to cost? The upcoming G20 is in Toronto's downtown core, a place with multiple access points from land and from water, just like the G20 summit in London last year. So let's look at how much it cost them. It was the most expensive security operation in London's history. Last year's emergency G20 meeting to address the financial crisis. Dignitaries rode in 40 armed convoys, anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 police officers and 12,000 additional security personnel clogged the streets. Frogmen swam the Thames, the city locked down, all to contain the massive protests with force.
Have we changed the culture of policing protests in Britain so that officers now believe that their job is to crush dissent rather than manage it?
And yet the final security bill was just $28 million. If the G20 in Toronto uses just half of the projected summit security budget, it would cost 16 times more than London. So, is this security, or are taxpayers getting robbed? My next guest knows what it takes to secure a city. She helped train security to protect London from nuclear, chemical, and conventional attacks. Sally Leafley joins me now from London. Sally, thank you so much for coming in. Here's what Canadians are trying to figure out, and we're hoping that you can help us with this one. We understand that we have, yes, both the G8 and the G20 summits happening one after the other. That could explain in part the $1 billion security cost. But we look at London's G20 cost, $30 million. We look at Pittsburgh's G20 cost, $18 million for security. Why are we paying so much?
Well, perhaps I see it slightly differently to the way you've put it. What I would expect is that both the meetings mean that Canada has to secure the meeting venues plus critical infrastructure, including airports and other parts of Canada, against the potential threat that may be aimed at the high threat individuals who are coming into Canada. But remember, it's a collective counter-terrorist operation in particular, as well as other events, including organised crime. But it's a collective counter-terrorist operation, and it's to protect the leaders of the world.
But presumably that same criteria was put in place for London and Pittsburgh, and yet they don't have anywhere near the same costs.
Yes, but you're very fortunate because the way in which the terrorism has been evolving in your country, from my perspective, is that a lot of it's under the radar. You've had some events that have come to the public notice. A lot is known to your security services, but the effective putting together of teams for an attack on these very, very significant targets can happen from Canada and any other country. But you're doing a very quick catch-up. Remember that London has had some decades of very large terrorist attacks, very large vehicle bombs from Northern Ireland, and more recently, of course, 5 years ago, we had the 7/7 attacks. Those 7/7 attacks were a couple of weeks. They were a long time in preparation, but the attack on the first day of the G8, which was up in Scotland, happened on the critical infrastructure on London, in the London Underground.
Of the security demands that...
Prime Minister Harper defends summit spending despite widespread criticism. The last G20 host city spent a grand total of $18 million. Canada's paying almost $1 billion for the G8 and G20. We ask, why?
Stephen Harper last week had been in
Europe, and actually he was in the United Kingdom meeting with the new Prime Minister of the UK, and during his press conference, which, they showed it on CPAC, you can hear Stephen Harper talking about his priorities and the agenda of the G20. Here is a quick clip here of Stephen Harper.
The G20, which was the main subject of our conversation today, will be focused on the global economy, on laying the foundations for sustainable and balanced growth. There are positive signs, but we are by no means out of the woods. The European financial situation is of concern, but at the same time, we do welcome the steps that have been taken to address this situation. We need to follow through on our G20 commitments, including stimulus, to avoid backsliding. But obviously, once stimulus expires, restoring public finances must be a priority. We've talked about the necessity of fiscal consolidation across the world and the necessity of implementing clear and realistic plans to reduce deficits and bring our budgets back into balance. We discussed other areas of G20 conversation, developing global growth strategies, the need for financial sector reform, and of course, resisting protectionism. And we're both working very hard to push forward the Canada-European Union trade discussions. On the G8, we discussed our child and maternal health initiative. As David mentioned, the United Kingdom has been a historic leader on these issues. We also discussed the leading role the G8 will continue to play in areas of peace and security, non-proliferation, terrorism, and organized crime. The G8 also has an important agenda in terms of accountability and ensuring that we live up to the commitments that we have made over the years. I look forward to working closely with the United Kingdom and our other G8 and G20 partners in the lead up to the summits. And of course, I look forward, David, to hosting you in Canada in a very short time, a very few weeks.
Word. So that was the Prime Minister Stephen Harper talking in the United Kingdom about, with a fellow Conservative. Now, David Cameron's the head of the UK, United Kingdom, and there's one thing that these two global leaders are disagreeing on. Here we have a New World Order debate going on within the G20, within the rulers of the world. Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada and Prime Minister David Cameron of the UK are not in total agreement on a global banking tax. You see, there's a lot of countries that want to have a tax on banks, and the Prime Minister of Canada doesn't believe in this global tax. Here is their words on this situation: global banking tax. David Cameron and Stephen Harper.
But Canada and the United Kingdom have had a different experience. Our experience was of a very large bailout by the taxpayer of the banks, and I think it's quite legitimate for people to say, well, in future what we need is a bank levy to make sure that banks are paying a charge in respect particularly of their unsecured lending. The experience in Canada is different, and I'm not surprised that they take a slightly different view, but that's the clear view we take, and we'll be arguing for that in the G20. We think that many other countries will want to take a similar approach.
On the question of bank tax, I think I've answered that question. Very different history here in Britain. The population's outraged about having to have bailed out the private sector. That's not the case in Canada. That's obviously why we see this situation very differently. And I think if you look around the world, if you look at the countries in the G20, you'll see that those who favor a bank tax versus those who don't, it almost directly relates to whether the taxpayers had to bail out their financial sector. Look, every country always has the option of pursuing its own policies for its own financial sector. That's an option that exists for Britain and for all of us. That said, we do have a strong agenda that has been agreed at previous G20s in terms of global financial sector reform that everyone's agreed on and that I think we are all dedicated to implementing.
Word up, Word of Mouth Wednesday. We just got another caller here on CKLN. Hello, caller.
Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt the discussion. I was just calling about the activities and the events that are taking place during the G20, and I was wondering if there's any way I can actually, if there's a website that retrieve the information from. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no problem. You can just check, but it'll be good for everyone to hear the websites. You can check out g20.torontomobilize.org. That's the Toronto Community Mobilization one. And then the other one you could check out is the People Summit one, which is peoplesummit2010.ca.
Okay, peoplesummit2010.ca.